Nearer, still nearer, close to thy heart. Draw me, my Savior, so precious thou art. Fold me, oh, fold me close to thy breast. Shelter me safe in that haven of rest. Shelter me safe in that haven of rest.
Hello, welcome to our study on Acts. My name is Clint McElroy, and today we'll be in Acts chapter 27. As a reminder, today, May 31st, we will have assembly at 10 a.m., so please join us if you can. We'd love to see you. In Luke chapter 24, as we've repeatedly referred to in our previous studies, there's the story of the two disciples on the road to Emmaus who were joined by a stranger who was in fact the Christ, resurrected. And after visiting with them for some time, he left their company, and they commented to themselves in verse 32 of chapter 24 of Luke. It says, "And they said to one another, Did not our heart burn within us while he talked with us on the road, and while he opened the scriptures to us?" That burning in the heart is interesting to me. I think it tells of the nature of our relationship with God. When we feel that burning in our hearts, that's an indicator that we are doing appropriate things to draw ourselves closer to God. And it's interesting here that it refers to, aside from being in their presence, that he was opening the scriptures to them, explaining to them how the scriptures meant what they meant. Specifically, that the Christ was meant to come and die and be resurrected. These things were all things that he expounded to them on the way, and they heard it, and they had heard very possibly similar things before, but they didn't understand the meaning, and now their eyes were opening to the meaning of all the prophecies, the meaning of the events that they had witnessed that had so confounded them. I really appreciated Jerry's communion service Sunday morning. If you were able to join us either through the video stream or live in person, he had a very good series of comments about the story of the road to Emmaus, the perspective of the men who were traveling there with Jesus, and what it must have seemed like to them. And I think it was very touching, and I appreciate that. And the story means a lot to me because we can find that burning in our hearts, I believe, through a continuous study of God's Word. Not just reading the Word, but thinking about what it could mean in our lives, dwelling on it when we're not reading on it, meditating on it, thinking about those things that are good, wholesome, and pure that we find in the Scriptures. Compare those things to the situations you find yourself in from time to time. Perhaps it would be a good way to know whether or not you're doing the right thing, judging by the Scriptures and what they say we should do. Again, I'm not saying this because I know everything and I can tell you how to behave. I in no way intend for that to be the case. I have admitted again and again that I am a sinner, and that my salvation is through the blood of Christ shed for my sins on Calvary's cross. It is not through any action of my own that salvation is mine. It's been given to me a gift, and I value that gift, and I want to share it with others. And I believe that maintaining a steady relationship in the Word is a good way to draw yourself closer to God. Find that burning in your heart, sustain that burning in your heart, and find that you can do works for God in His name in this life for others. So go with us now as we enter into this study, and bless you. Acts 27, from the NIV. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded his ship from Adramyttium, about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. From there we put out to the sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Sicilia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra at Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. Verse 7. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salmone. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lasea. Verse 9. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them, Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to the ship and cargo, and to our own lives also. But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete, facing both southwest and northwest. Verse 13. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity. So they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force, called the nor'easter, swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. Verse 16. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure, so the men hoisted it aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. Because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Citrus, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. Verse 21. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. Verse 30. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and soldiers, Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. Verse 39. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach, where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind, and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow struck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and to get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. So last week we studied chapter 26, and in chapter 26 we see that Paul avails himself of the opportunity to speak to King Agrippa, and in doing so he reveals that King Agrippa had some foreknowledge of the circumstance of the Christian dilemma in Jerusalem and in Judea at large. And we also see that he was not unfamiliar with some of the stories. Very likely had heard much of the doctrine that Christians believed in, and understood the relationship of those things to the scriptures, what they considered scripture, what we consider the prophecies of the Old Testament. He saw that those things were true, that they had been coming true. He witnessed some of those after the fact. He knew very well that the circumstances of some of the events that had transpired during the crucifixion and those events so many years before. And Paul avails himself of that opportunity to challenge Agrippa in a very interesting way. Subsequently, I did a couple of checkups and reread some stuff that I'd read before, and again, I didn't find any information that would indicate how Agrippa may have responded in time. Agrippa's relationship with his sister/wife and the governors and the Romans of the area are all pretty well documented through the histories of Josephus. I've never read Josephus. I've got his book, but I've never spent any time reading it. But apparently Josephus has never made any comment about any kind of faith expressed through the life of Agrippa. He went on to support the Romans in the fight between the Romans and the Jews, and it was not to the benefit of the Jews. But anyway, at the end of chapter 27, Agrippa has a discussion with Festus, and they determine that they would have let Paul go had he not appealed to Caesar. But to Caesar he appealed, and Festus was going to send him on. So that's where we find ourselves as we enter into chapter 27. We're in now the last two chapters of the book, and it's worthy of stopping for a moment and reflecting on the nature of the story, because the story is very interesting, and it's not something I've paid attention to in the past, but it is very interesting, and it plays itself out in the next two chapters, and we'll talk more certainly next week about some of the implications of those things we see written in chapter 27 and 28, how they act as parallels to the gospel account of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. And certainly nothing I've really ever thought twice about before. I have thought in times past that Acts ends very abruptly, that we don't get to go on into Rome and see Paul defend himself before Caesar. We don't know that story and how it unfolds. It's not recorded here, and there may be some significance to that. It may be that Luke intended to do that, although, frankly, in my personal opinion, I think the last few parts of the book are just gone. I think they were removed. It ends too abruptly. There's no wrapping up. There's no summary. There's no departure. There's no statement that indicates that he was finishing the book. There's just nothing. It just stops. So to me, that means something's gone that should be there. but it may have been removed for very good reasons. The implications of its absence have some significance, according to Mr. Wright here. In his commentary, talks about it briefly, and it is interesting, some of the parallels we find, not only to the ending parts of the Gospels, but also to some of the prophecies and stories from the Old Testament. So we'll be talking about that to some extent as we have opportunity. As we go on into chapter 27, sorry, I had turned my light off and I just now realized I needed to turn it back on. And we find that Paul is taken by a centurion of the Augustan regiment, and they set sail on a ship, and they head out the next day, landed at Sidon. So it says Aristarchus is with them. So Luke and Aristarchus and Paul are with this party, and Paul, of course, is there under the direction of the centurion. Julius there in Sidon gave Paul freedom to meet with his friends from the area, and they cared for Paul for a brief period, and then they set out to sea again. And it says that they sailed in such a way that Cyprus blocked the headwinds, and then they were passing Sicilia and Pamphylia, and they came to Myra, a city of Lycia. And at Myra, the centurion Julius found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy. So this would have been an Egyptian ship, if I understand correctly, the nature of an Alexandrian ship. And he put them on board that ship. He did not go with them from that point. So Julius is not with them any longer. So they sailed with some difficulty around a place I'm calling Cnidus, and the wind was not in their favor. So again, they sailed in such a way that Crete was blocking the headwinds, and they made it to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lycia, which is spelled differently, although I'm pronouncing it the same as Lycia of the region. So it's getting late in the year, and Paul has advised them that it's not going to be good for them, that not only the cargo and ship, but also their lives would be put in danger if they continue from this point at this time of year. So apparently at a certain time of year, it was well understood by sailors of the region, you didn't go out on the sea any longer. You waited on shore until the springtime came, at which time you could go back out to sea. But this centurion that was now with him did not listen to what Paul had to say. He listened to the helmsman of the ship, who was the expert, so that makes sense. And they decided to sail on because the harbor they were in was not suitable for wintering. And they hoped that they could reach a place called Phoenix of Crete before the winds got terribly bad. So when the south wind came, they set out intending to get to that location. But the wind became this northeastern, or Euroclydon is what it says in the New King James. And the ship was caught in the headwind, and they were not able to continue. And they stopped, or they were in the shelter of a land called Clauda. And when they had taken the skiff on board, which was the lifeboat, they girded the underneath of the ship with ropes because the waves were so damaging that they were afraid the ship would break up if they didn't gird it up with the ropes. And they were afraid they might hit some sandbars as well. And because they were exceedingly tempest-tossed, it says in verse 18 or 19, they started throwing tackle overboard. And after several days of no navigation because they couldn't see the sun or stars, they started giving up hope that they would make it. But it says in verse 21, after a long abstinence from food, Paul stood in their midst and said that they should not have left, but since they did, he said, "Take heart, there'll be no loss of life." And he tells them that he had a vision of an angel from God who stood in his presence the night before, or this particular night, and said that God's intent was for Paul to make it to Caesar, so all these that were with him would be safe, but they would certainly have to run aground and possibly lose the ship in order to make it safely to their goal. It says the 14th night, they were driven up and down the Adriatic Sea. About midnight, the sailors started sensing that they were getting close to land, and they started taking soundings, and they determined that the water was getting shallower. And fearing that they were going to run aground, they threw out 4 anchors off the stern and hoped for daylight to come. Now, we've heard Scott talk about these 4 anchors. We believe they were recently recovered by teams using this story as a reference. They found a location that fit the description, and they indeed found 4 anchors out in the sea nearby, and they were able to recover those anchors all together. Just assume that they're the same anchors. It seems awfully unlikely that they would find anchors just laying around anywhere. Some of the sailors at this point, after throwing out the anchors, were intending to escape the ship by lowering the skiff, but Paul intervened by going to the centurion and telling him that they had to stay on board in order for everyone to stay safe according to the direction that God had given him. So the soldiers cut the skiff free and no one got away. And it's then that Paul implores them all to take food. It's the 14th day and they've continued without food, and he urges them to take nourishment, and he reassures them that not a hair would fall from their head. And he took the bread and he blessed it in their presence, and they were all encouraged and they all ate the food. And it's there that we find out that there's 276 people on this ship. And once they'd eaten, that they threw out what was remaining of the food because they were afraid that it was too heavy to weight down the ship. 276 people, that's a lot of people. That's not the size of ship I have in my mind when I think of the size of this ship. It's way, way bigger, and I'm just amazed to conceive of how big this ship must be. So daylight finally did come, and they observed a bay, but they didn't recognize it, and they cut the anchors free, and they were hoping to make it to the bay, but the ship struck a sandbar, it sounds like, and they ran it aground fast. It wasn't going to come loose, and because of that, the waves tore up the back end of the ship. And at this point, the soldiers had a plan to kill the prisoners. At this point, they didn't want them to escape, but the centurion wanted Paul to survive, so at this point he commands the soldiers not to kill them, and everybody is told to jump in the water and swim to the shore, or grab something that floats and stay on it. And it says in that way all escape safely to land. So here we have this story, and this story is very reminiscent of the story of Jonah. In Jonah's story, he's running away from the task that God has given him, and because God has given him a task and he's running away from it, some bad things happen to him and the ship that he's on board, and the people that he's with want to throw him overboard, and do in fact throw him overboard. But here we have the opposite situation going on. God wants this ship to make it to where it's going, and he's protecting the individuals on Paul's behalf in order to ensure Paul's safe delivery to Rome. So it is very interesting that there is this parallel. Now, there's some things that Mr. Wright wrote in his book that are interesting about the nature of the sea to the Hebrew. He refers repeatedly to a fear, a deep-seated fear that Jewish people had toward the sea. They didn't see the sea as a way used to traverse or trade. They saw it as a place of dark power. Although God was in charge, they just didn't trust the sea. They thought it was a place of dark energy. And when we see this experience at sea, he says the implication is this is a traversal of the darkness of death, if you will. And this is similar to the events of the crucifixion. So Paul has gone through similar circumstances as Christ in that last week. Christ was judged by a governor. He was brought before the Sanhedrin. He was told, determined by everyone involved the powers that be, the Romans involved, that he was innocent, and yet he was sent on to a destination that God had in store for him. And that is the circumstance that Paul finds himself in. Paul is being driven through the same, very similar circumstances, and some 3 years of his life has been given over to this, at least 2, and now he finds himself in this darkness, this dark place, the shipwreck, cast about at sea for so many days. There are very interesting parallels here, and it makes me think a lot more about the way Luke has put this story together, the way that it will end in chapter 28. I'm looking forward to that discussion next week. I can't say enough about that, because it really has been a revelation to me to think in these terms. I certainly had been looking at the relationship between the Jewish people, both the religious and secular leadership, and the Romans through this reading, and I can see things kind of written between the lines that I had not noticed in previous readings. But this is kind of a new thing too, looking at it through this perspective of matching the events of the Passion Week, the circumstances of Christ's mission from God to find death at the cross and be resurrected on the third day. And the implications of that for Luke and the writing of the Gospel of Luke was that there was the book of Acts that would follow up. So what are the implications to us when the book of Acts ends in the next chapter without telling the rest of the story? I don't know. I haven't really given a lot of thought. Now I know what Mr. Wright is telling in his commentary, and we will certainly share that next time. I appreciate your kind attention, and I hope that you've been able to garner some encouragement from this chapter, and we will certainly have a much broader discussion next week. God bless.